everyone, it's Sevi. Welcome to my Aventurine guide, where I'll discuss his traces, Eidolons, best Relic and Lycone builds, team synergies, tips, and more to help you maximize his abilities if you decide to pull for him. Let's begin.
But I believe a chip is worth a miracle.
Aventurine is a 5-star imaginary preservation character who combines strong shield support utilities with surprisingly solid damage potential for a sustain. It's an interesting mix of defense and offense that helps him stand out as a preservation unit. Of course, he is first and foremost a sustainer, and thankfully he excels in that regard, offering very comfortable team protection through the hardest content. While he's obviously not going to deal dedicated DPS levels of damage, the fact that he can comfortably sustain and buff ally damage while also dealing a relatively good amount of damage for a preservation is impressive. Let's see how his kit combines all these aspects together. To start, all of Aventurine's shield strength and damage multipliers scale from his defense, so there's no issue of split scaling here. And to further cement Aventurine's hybrid kit, his Ascension 2 ability actually lets him convert his defense into crit rate. For every 100 defense past 1600 defense, that increases his own crit rate by 2%. This can reach a maximum of 48% crit rate increase, which requires a total of 4000 defense to achieve. This bonus only activates during battles, so you won't see it in his regular stat page. Thanks to this, Aventurine's build goals are more streamlined as building his defense improves both his shield strength and damage, and even if you aim for a defense-heavy build for maximum shielding, that doesn't compromise much of his damage output. We'll get back to this point later on, but for now, let's move on to his abilities. Casting his skill gives a shield to all allies that lasts for 3 turns. Everyone affected by a shield gets a huge effect resistance buff, which helps a lot in preventing annoying debuffs and crowd control effects. Another nice side effect of this is that it helps trigger effects that rely on effect resistance targets, the most notable one being Broken Keel's 30% effect resistance. And it's not just for himself, but possibly for other allies as well. Anyway, if you cast a skill with a previous shield still active, this can stack the shield health and refresh its duration. The shield can also be strengthened up to twice its original value. Aventurine himself also has a guaranteed resistance to a crowd control debuff once if he has the shield active. If it triggers, then it needs a 2-turn cooldown to reactivate. Combining this with his effect resistance from his shield and relic stats makes it really difficult for him to get debuffed or disabled. Once you unlock his Ascension 4 ability, he can grant his skill shield at the start of battle already. That sets up your defensive measures right away, which can also help him start generating SP sooner instead, rather than having to spend his first turn activating the shield. Furthermore, a special property of this shield is its ability to auto-stack itself, which is through Aventurine's blind bet and follow-up attack mechanics. Aventurine's blind bet points can be tracked in his HUD, and there are a couple of ways to gain these. First, if an enemy attacks an ally shielded by Aventurine, he gains 1 point. But if an enemy attacks Aventurine himself instead, he gains 2 points. If an enemy does a multi-target hit, then you also gain points based on how many teammates got hit. For example, in this clip, Aventurine gains 4 points, 1 from each of the 2 allies and 2 from himself. So getting hit, especially by AoE attacks, will help him gain points faster. Upon unlocking his Ascension 6 ability, when his ally launches a follow-up attack, that also grants him 1 point. This method can generate up to 3 blind bet points per turn of Aventurine, and when he takes his turn, this resets the trigger count back to 0. As such, follow-up attack type allies will synergize with him by helping him gain points faster. When he reaches 7 or more blind bet points, Aventurine consumes 7 to deal a follow-up attack that hits randomly up to 7 times. His blind bet points can also reach up to 10 maximum, and the leftovers will carry over after his follow-up attack, which helps avoid wasted points. By triggering this frequently, Aventurine can output consistent follow-up damage, as well as complement units that synergize with follow-up attackers. The constant barrage of follow-up attacks do add up over time, whittling away at enemy health and helping break imaginary weak enemies faster, which again, considering it's coming from a preservation unit, is pretty great. With his Ascension 6 ability unlocked as well, Aventurine's follow-up attacks will also fortify your team's shield, and the teammate with the lowest shield value gets an extra layer of shield fortification as they're more likely to need it. And again, he can fortify it up to twice the original value from the skill shield. This auto-refresh and stacking mechanic is pretty convenient and largely contributes to his ability to provide consistent shielding. The main scenarios where his shield can break through are enemies focus firing damage on one ally or just dealing so much AoE damage, and Aventurine can't refresh his shield soon enough to keep up. That's definitely a risk to watch out for in high difficulty battles, but generally speaking, his shields are very comfortable to work with. You also don't necessarily have to use his skill as often thanks to the auto-refreshing, which allows more room for him to use basic attacks and be a skill point positive unit for your team. Next, casting Aventurine's ultimate targets one enemy with multiple effects. 1. He deals damage to them plus high toughness damage to weak enemies. 2. He inflicts the Unnerved debuff for 3 turns, which increases any source of crit damage dealt to that target. And 3. In the spirit of gambling, Aventurine randomly gains 1 to 7 blind bet points to help expedite his next follow-up attack and shield refresh. For reference, his Unnerved debuff at ult level 10 can increase the crit damage taken by 15%. That's not a crazy amount, and it's only single target application, but nevertheless, any teammate can take advantage of it for a damage boost, particularly crit scaling units and Aventurine himself. Since it's a debuff as well, it's helpful for units who rely on debuff application like Acheron or Dr. Ratio. For his technique, it's another gamble, as using it increases your entire team's defense by a random amount in the next battle for 3 turns. You'll see one of these labels appear, which corresponds to the defense increase you get. If you keep reusing it, the highest value you get will be retained until you initiate the battle. This gives his shield and damage a nice early boost, and since the defense bonus applies to everyone, that also reduces the damage your entire team takes. If ever we get more units whose damage scales on defense, then this will also help boost their damage as well. As for Aventurine's bonus traces, he gets defense, imaginary damage, and effect resistance, all of which are useful for both his defensive and damage capabilities. Level up his skill and talent levels first, as those determine his shield health and follow-up damage, then his ultimate to increase his damage and crit buff. His basic attack is the lowest priority. I've been very satisfied by how comfy and complete his kit already feels at E0, and I'm not really left wanting for Eidolons. But for those who want more, let's see what they add. With E1, all allies affected by his shield now gain 20% crit damage for a team damage boost, and using his ultimate now also applies his skill shield effect to everyone, which also makes it even less necessary to use his skill. With E2, his basic attack now inflicts a 12% all-type resistance reduction for 3 turns on the target enemy. This further boosts your entire team's damage, and since this effect also counts as a debuff, he gets even more synergy with Acheron by adding an extra debuff source in his kit, as well as any other teammate that just wants debuff application. E3 increases his ultimate and basic attack levels. E4 allows him to buff his own defense after triggering his follow-up attack, and the follow-up attack now deals 10 hits rather than the original 7 for more damage. The 3 extra hits also result in his follow-up attack now generating 10 energy rather than its original 7, so that helps with his recharge time. E5 increases his skill and talent levels, and lastly, E6 gives him a 50% damage bonus for every shielded ally, up to a maximum of 150%. This basically supercharges his damage and fully realizes his potential. So moving on to Aventurine's build. One really nice feature is that even if you want to beef up his shield with defense as much as possible, you're still building towards his damage thanks to his defense scaling, so you don't compromise that much damage for shield strength. However, there is definitely room to squeeze more damage out of him at the expense of lowering his shields. A pure defense build is certainly very comfortable for sustaining, but in my experience, since the shield was generally more than enough, I ended up being able to trade some defense for crit, which let me get more offensive potential out of him. However, if what you just really want is survivability or don't want the pain of having to farm crit stats as well, I recommend prioritizing shielding and not worrying about min-maxing damage. Moreover, a shield-focused build can be especially helpful in Swarm Disaster, Golden Gears, or high MOC floors if you're having difficulty surviving. Of course, it ultimately depends on your preferred comfort level, and you should see what works best for you. Now, some general stat goals to keep in mind are the following. Try to get 4,000 defense, or as close as you can, to help maximize his crit rate conversion. As long as you haven't overcapped, then defense still has a lot of value since it doubles as increasing his crit rate too. Going past 4,000 still boosts his damage and shield strength, but no longer provides the extra crit rate. That's perfectly fine, especially if you're going for a shield-focused build anyway. But if you've significantly overcapped, then that means you have more room to aim for more damage-focused stats. The light cone's base defense and its defense bonuses, or lack thereof, will also affect how much defense you'll need from relic main stats and substats. If you're going for more damage, a great crit ratio goal is 75-150, with higher being better, of course. Thankfully, a high crit rate is easy to achieve with this passive. If aiming for a faster build, 120 or 134 are good early breakpoints to aim for and are fairly achievable for most players. So for the body piece, go for defense if you prefer more comfort. But if you already have high defense and want to further maximize his offense, go for crit damage. And due to his passive already giving a ton of crit rate, a crit damage piece gives a better crit ratio. For his feet piece, there are cases for either speed or defense. More speed is faster turn cycling, which helps him generate skill points and energy faster, so he keeps up with his fast allies and enemies, potentially gives the ult debuff more uptime, and allows for more opportunities to refresh his shields with a skill. This also helps more quickly reset the 3 blind bet point cap from his teammates' follow-up attacks. Another sample case is having his E2 and you want to apply his basic attack debuff more often for Acheron stacks. On the other hand, having more defense for stronger shields and higher damage per action can be situationally great too. His auto shield refresh can also be sufficient to maintain even without fast turns, and having a defense source with his boots helps reach the 4000 defense target. It's also possible you have good speed substats and or a speed set to make up for it. Really, it's a case-to-case basis depending on the team, relics, relevant buffs, and combat scenarios, so adapt what works well with your case. For the planar sphere, go for defense to help maximize his A2 passive and shield, whereas if maximizing offense, go for imaginary damage, ideally with high defense already. And for the rope, you generally just want defense instead of energy regen. With his follow-up attacks and getting hit by enemy attacks, which is very likely since he's a preservation unit, and more so if he has aggro increasing light cones, that's enough to hit a consistent 3-turn ult recharge time, or even faster depending on enemy attacks, without needing an ERR rope. While his ult is definitely useful, he's not extremely dependent on recharging it ASAP to fulfill his essential roles, especially when the trade-off is defense, which has much more value. As for substats, you're looking for defense, crit for more damage, speed according to your preference, and effect resistance. So if you want more comfort, all you need to focus on are defense, effect resistance, and speed. But to min-max damage, get crit stats as well. Now for his relic and planar sets. For a very flexible build that I also recommend for an easier farming experience, you can go for 2-piece set combos of the Knight for 15% defense, Grand Duke for a 20% follow-up damage bonus, Pioneer for a 12% damage bonus versus debuffed enemies, Wastelander for a 10% imaginary damage bonus, and Hackerspace for 6% speed if you're aiming for a target speed. These offer more room to choose pieces with the right main stats and good substats. For full sets, you also have choices between more shield or damage. For a maximum sustained focus build, the 4-piece Knight set boosts both defense and max shield absorption. For damage, the 4-piece Pioneer gives damage bonus and an increased crit bonus versus debuffed enemies. Remember that Aventurine can also debuff with his ultimate and specific preservation light cones. Then the 4-piece Wastelander set is technically also an option, but due to its imprisonment condition for the crit damage bonus, which you can fulfill with imaginary breaks or welt, this is more restrictive and generally less recommended over the Pioneer set. It also shares a cavern with the Fire set, which is a bad 4-piece set to farm, but if you already managed to get a good full Wastelander set, then go ahead. Moving on to planar ornaments. First is the Broken Keel, which gives effect resistance and gives a 10% crit damage team buff by hitting 30% effect resistance, and you can easily hit this simply by maintaining his shield. This set is a good middle point in buffing his own damage and his teammates. Meanwhile, the Inert Salsoto is the best general option for his personal damage. It gives 8% crit rate plus follow-up and ultimate damage bonuses upon reaching the 50% crit rate condition. Thanks to his innate crit rate buff, it's very easy to activate, and both of its damage bonuses are useful for him. The Bellabog set shares the same world with Salsoto. It gives 15% defense, but since you don't build EHR on Aventurine, you won't unlock its second 15% defense bonus that requires 50% EHR. However, 15% defense is still something, so if you manage to farm actual good pieces, it's not a bad alternative, especially if it helps reach the 4000 defense cap. Another damage focused set, particularly for pure fiction, is the new Sigonia set, which gives the user 4% crit rate and a stackable crit damage bonus when any teammate defeats an enemy, which can reach up to a huge 40%. There are other possible but less recommended options if you have really good pieces or have specific setups in mind. There's a Penacony set if your team has an imaginary DPS or is a mono imaginary template. The Fleet of the Ageless still helps if he's comped with attack scaling teammates, and the Sprightly Von Wax starting advanced forward effect might have extremely niche uses in MOC setups where you want him to move earlier. Of course, consider which worlds offer you the best planar set farming efficiency for building other units as well. Now when it comes to light cones, Aventurine thankfully has a ton of options to choose from, ranging from free to gacha choices. Different light cones can provide more defensive or offensive advantages or a balance of both. I'll discuss them individually first, then summarize their shield comparison afterwards. Let's start with the free-to-play friendly ones. Destiny's Threads for Woven is purchasable in the Forgotten Hall shop. It gives an effect resistance bonus, and for every 100 defense Aventurine has, that gets converted to a damage bonus. It caps at 4000 defense to max out, which is exactly what his A2 passive wants to. At S5, that can reach up to a 48% damage bonus. This mainly helps boost his personal damage, but doesn't benefit his shielding. We Are Wildfire is the other Forgotten Hall option. It reduces damage dealt to allies for 5 turns and heals the party at the start of battle, which has some niche usefulness like healing between simulated universe battles. But since the healing effect isn't useful in MOC or pure fiction, this isn't really as universally recommended. One more free-to-play option is Texture of Memories from Herta's store. It's a good base defense and effect resistance stat stick, plus a user damage reduction bonus if the user has a shield. For those benefits, it's an okay choice. It can generate its own shield, but it's not that helpful since it only affects the user and doesn't even stack with his own shield. Moving on to 4-star gacha options, Concert for 2 is the new 4-star Preservation Light Cone. It gives defense and a stacking damage bonus for every ally protected by a shield, which should practically be maxed out with Aventurine's team shield. It's a great generalist light cone tailor-made for him that balances his defensive and offensive stat needs. Day 1 of My New Life gives a defense bonus and increases the all-type resistance of your entire team to make everyone tankier. Simply put, it's a great option to increase his defensive support utility. This Is Me is the Battle Pass Light Cone. It's got a high base defense and defense bonus, making it a great defense stat stick, plus an ultimate damage buff. It's pretty solid, but not necessarily a high value option considering you have to pay to get and refine it. But if you already have this or are a regular BP buyer anyway, then it's definitely a good all-around choice. The trend of the universal market gives the user a chance to inflict burn if attacked by an enemy. This can synergize in specific setups, most especially with Acheron to help her generate points faster, or niche dot-related effects. Even if preservation units have higher aggro, having Aventurine get hit is still RNG, and he has no other innate aggro increasing effects, so this can have consistency issues. And lastly, Landau's Choice increases the user's aggro and decreases the damage they take. Making Aventurine targeted more often can help generate his blind bet points and energy faster, which leads to faster follow-up attacks. So in a sense, it does have some offensive benefits that aren't as obvious at first glance. It also increases his teammates' chances of survival by drawing away enemy attacks. However, its lower base defense and lack of a defense bonus means it has the lowest defense ceiling among the 4 stars. Then for his 5-star options, Inherently Unjust Destiny is his signature light cone. It currently has the highest base defense of any light cone, and with its big extra defense bonus, it's an insane defense stat stick for him and makes it incredibly easier to hit 4,000 defense. It also has extra offensive utilities. First, shielding an ally increases the user's crit damage for 2 turns, which will have near or fully permanent uptime thanks to his auto refreshes. Second, the user's follow-up attack now has a chance of inflicting a vulnerability type debuff that increases the damage an enemy receives. That will boost your entire team's damage, and it also synergizes with teammates that rely on debuff application. It's clear why this is his best light cone, but there's no pressure to pull for it, especially with a lot of good free and gacha alternatives. Japard's light cone Moment of Victory is an excellent alternative. It's also a huge defense stat stick thanks to its very high base defense and defense bonus effects, making the shield difference very close to his signature. It also increases his own aggro, so that yields similar benefits with Landau's Choice, like better team survivability, better energy recharge, and faster point stacking, but at least this time, it comes with a lot more defense. I personally don't think it's worth using Starlight currency to purchase from the shop, but that's up to you. Here's a quick graph of their shield comparison. While the light cones with both high base defense and defense bonus passives offer the best protection, even the lowest defense giving light cones are still capable of solid sustained performance, more so with certain passives. And again, a noticeable benefit of the huge defense stat sticks is that you also have more leeway to aim for more offensive stats instead while still having at least 4,000 defense. Of course, shield health is just one aspect, and there are damage-related passives or special utilities we discussed to keep in mind. All in all, that's a lot of options to choose from, which is great. Consider which light cones are available and what effects you think would best suit your Aventurine's build and team. Now moving on to Aventurine's team comp synergies. To start, he has a lot of universal value as he can simply assume a solo sustain role of almost any team, and he'll just work really well in keeping everyone alive. If you pretty much just want a universally thick shielder who also happens to offer solid damage, then Aventurine's your guy. Of course, there are some team synergies that complement his kit really well and make him or his teammates perform much better, and some anti-synergies that make him a less preferable option. Teammates that have follow-up attack-centric kits will help Aventurine generate his blind bet points even faster, which lead to more frequent follow-up attacks and shield refreshes from him. A very notable synergy is Topaz and Numby. All their attacks count as follow-ups, but more importantly, Aventurine returns the favor since his follow-up attacks will help advance Numby by hitting the enemy marked by Topaz. It's a really fun loop, and neat that it's 2 IPC characters characters working so well together. This follow-up attack loop will also work to varying degrees for other teammates. For example, Dr. Ratio's follow-up attacks and Aventurine have similar follow-up synergy. Plus, Aventurine helps Dr. Ratio's debuff-related bonuses. Aventurine's follow-ups can continuously deal imaginary toughness damage to give Shui stacks. Clara's counters can help recharge Aventurine's points, and the like. A follow-up focused team I really enjoyed using him in was combining Topaz and Dr. Ratio. Aventurine's extra points from ally follow-up attacks were always maxed out, the continuous barrage of follow-ups made Numby advance so frequently, and Aventurine's crit buff benefits all three of them as damage dealers. The entire team synergy is absolutely amazing. To help bump up Aventurine's damage, it's good to have supports that give team-wide buffs or debuff enemies, mainly via Harmony and Nihility supports respectively. In many teams, most sustains generally don't maximize such damage amplifying effects since they contribute little damage, but with Aventurine, the team gets even more mileage out of such effects. The main exceptions are of course attack and HP related buffs, which are useless for his damage. If you're comping Acheron with Aventurine, then you can also enhance Aventurine's debuff application by equipping the Trend Light Cone or his signature Light Cone, which allows his follow-up attack to apply a debuff too. With such equipment, he can boost his debuff application rate to help charge Acheron's ult faster. A notable anti-synergy to be mindful of is if you have teammates that actually want to get hit or damaged. Preservation characters have a higher chance of getting targeted by enemies, so Aventurine might compete with teammates that prefer getting hit to trigger certain effects. For example, Clara's regular counters trigger by getting hit. She still works fine with them though. She has her ult effect, and you'll want to put them in the second and third slot to increase the chance of blast hits getting both of them. Since shields also prevent damage, Aventurine should also steer clear of characters that actually rely on getting damage, like Blade, who loves getting hurt to deal more damage. Lastly, a small universal tip, as mentioned before, is that you can position Aventurine in either the second or third slot of the team. This increases his chances of getting hit with enemy blast attacks, which also means that his adjacent allies will get hit and contribute to his blind bet point stacks. His shield should be more than capable of ensuring that allies hit with collateral damage will still be quite safe. Finally, some observations about Aventurine's auto battle behavior. He generally defaults to basic attacks every turn and uses his skill if a teammate loses a shield to reapply it. Though there are also cases where he might use his skill if an ally has low shield health if there were a lot of skill points available. As for his ult, he uses it immediately once recharged and seems to target the elite or boss. While prioritizing basic attacks at least makes him SP positive, it can lead to the occasional situation where your team can be more at risk of taking damage. For example, if a teammate already has very little shielding left, Aventurine would still use his turn to do a basic attack. That means that if the enemies unfortunately pile on a lot of damage and Aventurine can't trigger a follow-up attack soon enough to refresh the shield, then it can lead to that unit taking damage, or worse, be deadly for them. It doesn't happen that often though, and if it does, it'll typically be in the hardest difficulty battles where you do want to do manual battle anyway. Overall, thanks to his auto shield refreshing mechanics, and more so if your team has follow-up attack allies to maximize his point generation, auto battles are generally going to be very comfortable. And that's going to be it for this Aventurine guide. Let me know in the comments what you think of him and if you're going to be pulling for him. If this video helped you out, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!